One of the things which I think is critical that both of our speakers raise is the manner in which we need to actually collaborate around these issues. The government can't do it by itself, industry can't do it by itself, and we think that the university sector is perfectly placed in order to contribute significantly in our understandings of, from our position, how research will inform the ways in which we go about making these decisions. RMIT, as a global university of technology, design and enterprise, is also specifically positioned in order to contribute to ideas around what new cities should look like, the manner in which the transport to those cities should be facilitated, and to really understand how we might begin to embrace new technologies that facilitate ways in which those cities are able to be healthy, prosperous places to live. We're going to have a couple of our key researchers make brief presentations about the work that they're doing. First, we have Dr. Elizabeth Taylor from the Centre for Urban Research. And the Centre for Urban Research is really a core focus point around transport, the ways in which our cities are able to evolve and change, but also really looking at the manner in which we can draw on data and real information that might begin to inform and allow us to understand policy. Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks to Jay for inviting me to speak and to the preceding speakers. When I started my PhD, which was about 10 years ago, I was actually interested in what were then high-profile claims around the impact of planning on housing affordability. But what I ended up doing was opening my PhD thesis with a quote from a rather obscure 1923 novel by Sinclair and Lewis called Babbitt. That book is largely about what's called boosterism, which is, I guess, bragging about a town. But there's this one passage that I really like about Babbitt's neighbour, Howard Littlefield, PhD, Publicity Counsel of the Zenith Street Traction Company, who could, on 10 hours' notice, appear before the Board of Aldermen or the state legislature and prove absolutely, with figures all in rows and with precedents from Poland and New Zealand, that the streetcar company loved the public and yearned over its employees, that all its stock was owned by widows and orphans, and that whatever it desired to do would benefit property owners by increasing rental values and help the poor by lowering rents. So one reason I find that funny now is that it shows a tram company in America actually making a lot of money, which was something that quickly changed when car companies came along, including actually literally buying up streetcar networks just to rip them out. The other reason I like it is that it really points to this inevitable dilemma with any kind of planning intervention, which is that you can claim to benefit property owners by increasing rents and help the poor by lowering rents, but of course they kind of cancel each other out. And there's just inevitably a paradox where planning is involved in allocating rights, property rights, and they have economic value, and that's something I think we should just, embrace and kind of evaluate. A lot of my research since then has looked at the dilemmas of the challenges really of land and transport planning and integration in Victoria from this perspective, focusing on property interest groups and their influence on urban consolidation policies. So I looked at where homeowners are most engaged with what was mentioned before, like fighting off infill housing developments in the suburban backlash. I also looked at the windfall gains that are made by extending the urban growth boundary, and at the contested efforts to try to tap into that windfall gain through betterment taxes. We're actually seeing some funding from that now. I've recently started looking at, spent the last few years looking at car parking conflicts. So this is where housing is pitched against free parking, and it's this flashpoint for urban change and for urban consolidation. So the quote often uses, "Fight the towers or kiss your car park goodbye." And Robin asked me before, are you going to talk about car parking in regional centres? So I could, I won't today. Looking at the historical origins, though, of where these conflicts over car parking come from, what I found was through mechanisms like post-war implementation of minimum car parking requirements, we've done a really fabulous job of planning for car parking in cities. I think the quote before from Eisenhower, you are what you get what you inspect. I think that applies to parking. As Donald Tuke puts it, minimum car parking requirements are a hidden tax on development to subsidise cars. If urban planners want to encourage housing and reduce traffic, why tax housing to subsidise cars? And that's effectively what we've been doing in the post-war period. a lot of our urban form, and at a practical level, a lot of our planning system, even now, it celebrates the low-density sprawl. Actually, I didn't say sprawl then. Low-density development, the separation of land uses, and the rights of private cars. And this is really the default, I think, against a lot of what other ideas are held up against and criticised. And so some things are definitely improving, but we have a default growth pattern, and these are furthering inequalities in the city. So that's inequality in access to affordable housing and to the wealth generated by housing, inequalities in services, particularly transport infrastructure. And most of our fixed rail system in Melbourne was built before the 1930s by private investors mostly and speculators. Public investment in public transport, even when it has grown substantially, that is not often, is definitely well outpaced by growth in population and housing development. One of the projects I'm now involved in focuses on the early delivery of transport infrastructure to new growth suburbs in Melbourne. The new suburbs, outer suburbs of Melbourne, are expected to accommodate an extra 500,000 new homes in the next 35 years. I don't know if those projections are right, but we'll go with it. The general trend there is about scarce local employment and inadequate or at least delayed and uneven public transport infrastructure. There are a lot of planning and funding assumptions and barriers that tend to make it quite difficult to do transport-led development now. And I believe that early transport delivery is critical to address transport inequities and health disparities between residents of established, well-serviced suburbs and those attracted to affordable housing on the fringe. I think a lot of us share that view. Part of that project is about identifying potentially more efficient and equitable ways for both the public and the private sectors to fund transport options to residents of new suburbs. In terms of how this all crosses over with decentralisation, and especially fast rail and rail-oriented settlements, some of the critical questions I'd like to explore include: what can we learn from history about the advantages and also the pitfalls of all the past efforts at decentralisation and new towns in Australia? We have, for example, the Whitlam-era National Growth Centre program, Albury-Wodonga, Campbellfield, Wangaratta, and we know some of them offhand, but I think research really needs to challenge some of that broad brush learning and anecdotes. It's not good enough to just say Canberra's a bit boring. And I think there's a real opportunity to delve into some of those failures and successes and outright duds. There's the idea that Australia should be able to engage with a more nuanced evaluation of the role of new cities and new settlements was the subject of a recent conversation article I wrote with Rob Freestone and Julian Bollitter. In terms of transport specifically, which is really where I came into it, I'd like to see research on the successes and failures of past rail-oriented developments in Australia. What were, going back 100 years, the pitfalls of speculative transit-led developments and the advantages and long-term legacies? Also, I'd like to see specifically how past projects, both road and rail, have been funded and financed, who bore those costs, and long-term what the costs and benefits are. Specifically also, why did past fast rail projects for Australia falter? I mean, we all know this is not the first. So really an appraisal of what did and didn't work. And also, what are the best practice examples and what can we learn from the use of different finance models for transit-led development elsewhere? And London would be one example. More broadly, I'd like to question to what extent our past decisions and policies have entrenched the current urban form and population patterns. I've recently been familiarising myself with the early history of transport-led speculation in Melbourne, so the spurious Circle Line, the Octopus Act, and there's some cautionary tales there, but on the other hand, the legacy is most of our rail network. Also looking at some of the transport studies from the 1970s and 1980s, the Loney Report, for example, and the triggers for mass public disinvestment in public transport at that time. And what strikes me reading those reports now is how that period of decline in rail is presented in these reports as though this was completely unrelated to previous decades of investment in roads and in car parking and in supporting a car-based urban form. It's like, oh no, rail is failing. I think it's disingenuous to default to this narrative of inevitable economic drive toward agglomeration of our major cities without at least reflecting on how active a role government policies and agencies have had in undermining the alternatives. And there's obviously larger economic shifts and employment drivers at play, but I think there's a lot of valuable research to go on there. But I'd also even question the role of policy in some of those shifts in employment, even around agriculture. So to finalise, I grew up in Mount Clear, Ballarat, and both my parents are from Castlemaine, so very much regional. And I grew up also in decades in which it seemed to me that the express role of government was closing train lines rather than opening them. I have vivid memory of just the sense of everything shrinking. There was little, less, nothing. I used to like looking at old street directories, which is the sign of a true nerd. But looking at the old tram and train net services that used to be in the area and just like, wow, it's another world then. But also schools, swimming pools, hospitals, pubs, shops, trains, whole towns. Everything seemed to be naturally diminishing in regional areas at that time. Looking back, I think there were obviously broader and global shifts at play, but that I also see that there are some really specific conscious decisions made to undermine some of those places. Like many people from Ballarat, I moved to Melbourne, and I'm unlikely to move back because the weather is horrible. But I have bought a house in country Victoria in Elmore, which is past Bendigo, 150 kilometres from Melbourne actually. And we made that decision in large part because of the presence of a very small reinstated passenger rail service through to Echuca, which is possibly, hopefully, 50 years from now, maybe, on a future speculative fast rail track. I'd actually settle for a few extra trains, but there we go. But illustrating how small towns often welcome growth, Elmore still has a 1920s Babbitt-style Elmore Progress Association, rather than the metropolitan version of a community group, the Save Our type, which is really about defence against growth. Elmore benefits from its proximity to Bendigo, but its volunteer-led community goes out of its way to advocate for services and to attract businesses. Having feet in both places is a reminder of how uneven the experience of growth and public investment in Australia has been, particularly since post-war period. As population growth just generally gets on the agenda again, it's well worth questioning and providing a forum, as with Balance Victoria, why this is the case, who pays for the status quo, and not just criticise what the alternative costs might be, and what capacity, if any, we have to shift this as well as other inequalities of growth. And I'd like to reiterate that I preferred the name Committee for Everywhere Else. Thank you.